No, thank you, Alan. And thanks everyone for coming along. And I've been to my first two sessions in this event series this week, and so this is my third, and I'm starting to get a handle on what this is all about. So obviously want to welcome everyone. Before I introduce Kate, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on the lands in which Monash University operates and where I'm coming from today, and where we do our work at Monash University, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Because we're operating online, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which you're all gathered on today, and again pay my respects to elders and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be viewing this recording or attending today. So I'm going to introduce Kate, and Kate will speak, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion towards the end. So Dr. Kate Greer is a research fellow at the Centre of Climate Change and Sustainability Education at the University College in London. Kate will be presenting on the topic From Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh and Beyond, a participant's perspective of COP27, the climate emergency and education. So in this seminar, she will share some of her reflections on COP27 as the Action for Climate Empowerment Plan is negotiated, and as participants navigate the complexities of the UN conference being held at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So I'm going to pass it over to Kate. Kate will share all of her knowledge and expertise with us, and then we'll have time for some questions towards the end. But Kate, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Emily, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Alan, for the invitation to speak as part of this seminar series. I understand you've had two fantastic seminars so far that have been really engaging and have generated a lot of discussion afterwards. So I really hope that this one, it'll probably have a slightly different flavour to it, but I hope that you'll feel comfortable and intrigued enough to come and participate in the conversation as we go through. I really encourage you to ask questions or contribute as we go through as well. It's not a formal academic publication, so let's try to interact a bit and imagine we're in a room together. So yeah, I'm going to, as Emily said, I'm going to share some reflections of my experiences at COP26 and COP27. So last year in Glasgow, this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. I'll start with some really brief comments on the COP process overall, because I imagine there's some people in the group who maybe aren't very familiar with what it actually is. Apologies if everyone already knows it, but I think it can be helpful just to check in on that first. Then I'll briefly reflect on COP26, and then I'll spend most of the time focusing on COP27. Now I just need a few housekeeping things before we start. I have only just returned from COP27. I came in very late on Sunday night, so the reflections are still reflecting. Okay, so I imagine if I do this presentation in 4 weeks' time, the reflections might be something quite different. But I hope, let's just go with them while they're fresh and see what happens in discussion. And I'm not quite sure as well where it's all landed for me. Like some of it's quite confronting, the experience of COP. And so I'm still working actually through some of the emotional sides of that. Also, I think at times I might move into travel log a bit. So because it's quite a photo heavy kind of presentation. And I thought I'll do photos because that's kind of gives you then a picture of what it's like. And I sort of didn't have time to do the beautiful academic words. So hopefully that helps to paint the picture. And yeah, and just to say, I am from Melbourne. I'm really excited to be here with you in Melbourne today, even though it's 10 o'clock at night here in London. So yeah, thanks for having me. And now I'll just share my screen and my slides, and off we go. But yeah, please do sing out if you've got questions as we go through. Okay. Okay, so can we see the presentation, not the notes? Great, thanks. I'll just shift this. Okay, so first of all, just a quick sort of overview of what COP is for those who don't know. So it's an annual conference of the parties where the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change come together to progress the key documents of the UNFCCC. It's carried out in two different zones. There's a whole lot of activity in a blue zone, and there's a whole lot of activity in a green zone. And the blue zone is where the negotiations actually take place. And so all the parties, the negotiations to progress the Framework Convention on Climate Change and negotiations to progress the Paris Agreement. The participants in this space, there's delegations from the 197 parties, and then there's a lot of observers accredited by the UNFCCC, and then there's an enormous number of side events, exhibits, and cultural events as well. The green zone is an area that's hosted by the government that's hosting the COP each year. Its participants, it's open to the general public. There's lots of youth groups, lots of civil society, academia, artists, business, lots of events and workshops. And each time the COP happens, these spaces are really quite different. In other years, there's a very high level of activist engagement as well. This year, many of you would probably be aware that the activist engagement was quite a lot lower, and activists weren't actually allowed near the venue. They were given a separate venue away from the main conference centre, and I'll come back to that later. Sorry, I've just got in my screen, I've got you all in a funny place. Okay. So where does education fit? So education within the COP space fits in an area of work that's known as ACE, or Action for Climate Empowerment. And now ACE is a banner expression for two particular aspects of the negotiations. There's Article 6 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and Article 12 of the Paris Agreement. These are quite dry, these documents, and not necessarily good for engaging the public. And so they've sort of rebranded, I guess, as ACE. And there's 6 elements that sit under ACE, which includes education. So in ACE, we can see that education is just one of those elements. And sometimes we talk about climate change education and ACE as being interchangeable, but actually ACE refers to something that's much, much broader. On the one hand, education during the negotiations can then get caught up amongst some of these other sort of competing concerns, particularly around public participation or around public access to information. And so things like campaigns can, or governments can say they're contributing to ACE through campaigns, whereas that doesn't necessarily mean that they're delivering quality climate change education. So on the one hand, it can be a bit problematic. On the other, viewing education as part of ACE can also help to expand our conceptions and to position education amongst a range of other elements that are helping society engage with and respond to climate change. So I think there's pros and cons there, but that's where it sits. So turning now to COP26. And on the way to COP26 was quite an extraordinary event. These were some of the banners that were sort of displayed all around the UK, and this was at Euston Station on the way up to Glasgow. There was an enormous amount of pressure on it. It was hosted by Britain and the UK and Italian government, and it was the first COP for 2 years because there'd been a delay from COVID. It was really carried out under the shadow of COVID, so it was quite complex for that reason. There were a lot of questions about would it go ahead or wouldn't it? What would it mean if the country, people who weren't vaccinated, would they be able to access, wouldn't they? We had to do testing every day. There was a lot of mask wearing. There was an awful lot of time with foggy glasses, you know, and activism, student activism. You know, this came, you know, after the wave of recent student activism. And so Greta's presence was a really big deal outside of COP. At COP26, there were 40,000 registered attendees, and the queues to get in were just enormous. So my attendance at COP26, so I went along on behalf of the MEIS project. Now, some of you might be familiar with the MEIS project. It's called the Monitoring and Evaluating Climate Communication and Education Project. And so my job at COP was to advocate for monitoring and evaluation amongst the ACE discussions and during the negotiations of the ACE text. I presented on a side event, and then I met with policymakers and political actors. And then also a really big part of it was, some of that communication that comes from being there. So I had to tweet, and that is, ever present in your mind if you're not a natural tweeter. You're always sort of walking around going, oh, is that tweetable? Is that tweetable? And so anyway, so COP26, importantly for education, it was really significant because they were negotiating a new work program on action for climate empowerment. And the previous work plan had been negotiated, work program was 2012. So it had been a long time between work programs. And this process finalized at midnight, I think it was, on the Friday. So on the last day of the negotiations, they kept stretching the time, and finally parties agreed to this new work program. And I've included a link in the slides and a bit of the text there. Oops, I'm back. So, although one of the really important things about this work program was that it includes, it's easy to criticize these documents as being very, very high level and lacking specificity, and being not necessarily providing the direction or the strong guidance that some of us might like. However, one notable inclusion in the work program was the commitment to an action plan, and that an action plan with short-term, clear, and what's the last word, and time-bound activities. And so this became a really important launching pad for what then happened this year. So coming back from COP26, it was, my reflections then were, as I've got on the screen. So firstly, it was the sense of urgency that I felt in there. I remember having a call with my niece back in Australia, and my niece was 16 at the time, and she rang me to say, what's going on? Greta says that the people in there aren't really doing anything, and they just go in and talk, and no one really cares, or no one's really trying very hard. And I was able to say to her very wholeheartedly that actually the people in those spaces just work incredibly hard under very difficult circumstances to do what they can. So the sense of urgency was quite profound. Secondly, I noted that the diversity really struck me, the diversity of participants with a range of expertise who participate in these processes. And that's youth participants, that's elders, that's researchers, policymakers and practitioners, and all of those voices and all of that expertise comes together at these forums. Thirdly, a really significant realization for me that I hadn't probably connected with previously was about the role of informal influence at these events. And so probably the photo on the left and the photo on the far right are two examples of this. So the photo on the left was a group of political actors, we'd call them, or the observer organisations, who work tirelessly alongside the policymakers at these forums, and they meet with the policymakers informally. They catch them as they come out of rooms. There's 1,000,001 WhatsApps going on. And they talk to each other. They try to organise the observer organisations to be able to speak coherently to the policymakers. And they're not necessarily in these formal meeting rooms that I think all the work gets done. The photo on the right of me sitting on the little box is I was having a little break and I was having some lunch, and I talked to someone on the phone, and my Australian accent came out. And you're in very, very crowded spaces, so it's quite hard to have private conversations. But I happened to be sitting next to someone who was the Australian negotiator on ACE, who overheard my conversation. And we struck up a bit of an accord, and we chatted, and I was able to keep working with her over the course of the week. And it just really, I mean, that's just quite a random, occurrence, but it does really it really demonstrated to me the significant role that informal influence plays in these spaces. And if you are fortunate enough to be able to go there, it's quite incredible what you can contribute to. So, which then also speaks to, well, who isn't there? You know? So I was also really struck last year by the interconnectedness of local action and intergovernmental policy. So this group on the left, so the group of observers in particular, many of them were able to speak on behalf of their very local context. So what are they actually doing in their local communities, in their national contexts? And then they bring that local expertise to the international policy space. And that was really quite a powerful realization for me as well, that intergovernmental isn't more important than local, but actually they come together in a forum like this. And then the final one from 26 was probably that my understanding of time and how the time, there is 2 weeks, these conferences, there's 4 days in which you can negotiate on ACE, and there's 4 hours in those 4 days that are actually set aside in the agenda to work out these texts. And so whilst there are really strong advocates amongst the national policymakers, whilst there's an incredibly committed group of observers, time is a real problem that precludes significant progress. And that's just a factor. So what do we do with that? Okay. So COP26, amazing experience, exhausted afterwards. Then here we go. And then we turn up 12 months later at COP27. So COP27, my COP27 experience very much started with asking questions about, should I go? Right? You know, COP26, I'm based in London, and COP26 was in Glasgow, so I could catch a train up there, and I didn't have to question carbon miles, cost, and human rights record. And many of you will probably have engaged with some of the media around this, and there was the article from Naomi Klein, and she's had quite a strong campaign on Twitter about raising the voices of activists and those who are being prevented from activism by the Egyptian government. And then in the UK, there was a lot of, you've probably observed it. I don't know, some of you will, some of you won't, but the lack of engagement by the Prime Minister, and then previous Prime Minister, and then the next Prime Minister 2 weeks later, to attend, and then the King Charles wasn't attending, and whilst these concerns are very far outside of my realm of influence, they actually really made me think about A, is it the right thing to do to go, and B, how much impact can I have? Is it really worth it? There were questions being raised about, what do these people do? They go into that conference centre, they talk, they go home, we'll be tourists. I was also really concerned about the cost, my existing workload, and all of those sort of questions. Anyway, and then after much umming and ahhing, I decided to go. I thought, I'm not Naomi Klein. I don't have a voice. I haven't created that voice or platform. My silent, passive protest was probably not going to do as much as going and contributing my research-informed insights to the process wherever I could. So after a great deal of agonising, I decided to go. And in going, I sort of developed a bit of a purpose. So to try to make sure I knew why I wanted to be there, what I was going to try to achieve. So the first one is about contributing research-informed understandings of climate change education to discussions wherever I could, particularly with policymakers and political actors. Secondly, was to undertake some research on policy influence, and I'll come back to that. Third was to strengthen existing relationships with policymakers and political actors. These relationships take a lot of time and a lot of energy and years to foster. And if you started building those relationships and you've got an opportunity to go and do them again, it's worth investing in that. And then fourth was to foster potential collaborations for other research or impact activities. And then the fifth one, which wasn't my highest priority, but my manager's, my manager, Professor Nicola Walsh, that was her highest priority, I think, was to promote our research centre. and build connections for that. And so in doing all the things that we did, that helped to achieve that objective. And now getting ready to go, if you haven't been, it really buries you in a mire of logistics and confusion. There's emails and Zoom meetings, and it's an enormous amount of work. Once you've made the decision, you sort of suck that up and off you go. So now I'll start with some of the travel log photos, okay, just to put you in the space of Sharm el-Sheikh. And so Sharm el-Sheikh is at the northern end of the Red Sea. It's a resort town. It's lots of shiny and new stuff, and there's lots of building underway. It's located in a desert with mountains. You know, it's on the coast, but otherwise it's sort of desert, and there's mountains you can see them. You don't go into them, but they're in the background sort of the whole time. There are enormous highways with not a lot of cars on them. There is these rather large stretches of very new 6-lane highway with very small strips of bike lane that had recently been painted on them. So I probably wouldn't rush out and ride my bike on there, but beautiful bitumen nonetheless. And there was also in this bottom right picture, you might see the black dot in the middle. It was quite curious to someone who I haven't been in an environment like this before. And, you know, COP, obviously there are a lot of security concerns. There were these security guys who were placed every couple of 100 meters along the main roads, under these tiny little umbrellas out there in the sun. So it was quite I don't know, you were there, you felt aware of security the whole time you were around, you know, police and traffic police, and yeah. Anyway, so that's Sharm el-Sheikh by day, and Sharm el-Sheikh by night. In the really touristy part, it glows and shines and shimmers in the touristy part. This wasn't the bit where I was staying on the UCL budget. Yeah. Now onto the negotiations. Okay, I thought it might be helpful just to describe the negotiations a bit. So for those who aren't familiar with it. So this is in one of the main plenary halls. And at the start of the week, the agenda is set for each of the meetings in these plenary halls. And then at the end of the week, you all come back together in this plenary hall to report on the decisions. And this is a really, really formal space where countries can make interventions, but it's quite it's a really formal environment. And there's time in there for the constituency groups, the NGOs, to also make some interventions. The next level of meetings are called informals. And informals happen in these sort of spaces. Delegates have their country nameplate on them, and they're chaired by a co-facilitator, and then the countries speak to each other through the facilitator. So again, it's quite a formal space to be resolving sticky, tricky issues and wording. In these meetings, they kind of discuss the process, they make interventions about particular issues of concern. Sometimes they get to discussing text. And as I said earlier, they had 4 hours total across the week in these sort of spaces. And then there are informal informals. That's another layer of the meetings. And these are less fixed in the agenda. And in these ones, they have these really interesting, they're still quite formal, but they're not quite as countries can actually speak to each other. And then they also have these huddles. So on the screen, you can see a huddle, and that's when there's something that's not progressing and the co-facilitator tells parties to huddle, and they get in the huddle and they whisper. So the observers can't hear, basically. And so that way they can really thrash things out in their country, in their groups. So they all have groups that they're part of. So it might be the Africa group, for instance, or an umbrella group that's made up of America and the US, Australia, Japan, Canada. I can't remember who else. So there's these really, it's quite a structured way of getting through the negotiations and resolving text. And this year's COP, they probably ended up having maybe 12 hours of these informals across the week. And then sometimes there's closed door sessions as well. This year, the action plan, as I said, was the focus of our discussions. for ACE. And with seconds to go, the parties agreed to the action plan. So it was a pretty exciting moment. There was a great deal of whooping and cheering and clapping and whatnot. And so this is a 4-year action plan that they agreed to. And this action plan sets out 4 areas of work, which I've got on the screen there. I won't go into them in too much detail, but it still ends up being quite a high level document. And that's really important because then it allows countries, it has to be about how can this be applied in national contexts. The real sticking points for this action plan that may be of interest concern the inclusion of a particular youth focal point. So some countries wanted there to be a specific role designated in this, where a youth representative of a country could go and participate in the negotiations alongside the other focal point. I don't think we'd say adult, but anyway, the other focal point. This was really sticky because whilst it sounds like a great idea on the surface, it actually can create problems for some countries who actually can only afford to send very, very small delegations. And if their delegations have to include one youth representative, that then means the other delegates will be spread across a lot more areas of the negotiations. So it's a bit tricky. Other sticking points were finance, which won't be a surprise. And the final one was on how human rights would be included in the text. We don't have time to go into that today, but they were the 3 really difficult things. And then the research was the other part of my work. And so my research is really interested in policy and trying to understand why climate change education continues to be marginalised in policy. And so at the COP, I was looking at examining the nature of policy influence that goes on. Who are the influencers and what do they do? How do they go about it? And I conducted interviews with policymakers and political actors. And if you do have a great idea to go and do research at the COP, I can't overstate how complicated that is and how difficult it is to find time to sit down with people at these events and when their schedules are changing all the time. So the pictures just give an example of some of the sort of places that you end up doing an interview. It's very hard to find anywhere quiet. The conference centre is under a flight path. The conference centre is really noisy and people are really busy. Anyway, I ended up getting 6 interviews out of the 15 that I was hoping for, and I'll have to follow up again now. And there were some really tricky issues for me in preparing the research in terms of the ethics. And particularly I am concerned with how these people, these policymakers who are in very prominent positions, how I represent them in any reporting that I do, because I do really want to protect these people. Are often in very difficult, I'm really interested in that group of people because they are often, they work within structures and systems, and you've got to look after them within those structures and systems. They're not necessarily, my job is not to expose them in any way. And so how do you make sure your research contributes meaningfully, but also how do you protect the identity and anonymity of some of these people? So that was a bit of a thing that I'm still working through. Now I'll just move into, I'm conscious of time, into some of the other parts that go on at the COP. So there's the circus. Some people, you might have heard people refer to the COP circus. And the COP circus is it's the pavilions, they're country pavilions. Some of them are absolutely spectacular and it's very easy. And I did find myself getting pretty cynical about some of these sort of spaces. They're really elaborate and some more than others, and they cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to rent the space. And then there would obviously be the cost to actually build the pavilion on top of that. So it's easy to get a bit, I don't know, when you're working in an NGO space mostly, or an education space, the amounts of money that goes on in these sort of environments sometimes can be a bit hard to stomach. But these spaces are where there's lots of events that go on and an enormous number of panels, and it's where you meet and you talk and so on and so forth. So these are some of the pavilions. These one down the bottom, these are some of the small booths that are for more the NGO kind of space. So whereas this one in the top left was the World Health Organization. And that was a beautiful set of lungs made out of recycled car parts. It was actually quite an extraordinary piece of art. A real bright spot for me was the Australian Pavilion this year. So last year, the Australian Pavilion was sponsored by Santos, which is a gas and oil company. And this year, the sponsors weren't apparent. It had a beautiful piece of Aboriginal artwork. It had a number of panels. The one that I went to down the bottom was from the Indigenous Peoples Organisation. And it was really quite a moving and poignant discussion of the continuing impacts of climate change, particularly the renewable energy boom on the lands, on some of these lands, and how the mining for resources for renewable energies continues to threaten cultural heritage. It was a really vibrant space. It sort of announced, it felt like, and maybe that's what I wanted it to say, but it felt like Australia was back, and I was really heartened. I was really heartened by that. It also had fantastic coffee, and it was very hard to get good coffee, and the queue stretched kind of around the block. So well done. It was St. Ali coffee, which many of you, there's a St. Ali at Monash, right? Yeah, it was great. And I was really lucky to meet the Australian ACE focal point from DC, Department for Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water, who is very enthusiastic and very keen to connect with what's happening in Australia. So that was all really heartening experience. Another really interesting aspect of the circus was the Children and Youth Pavilion. And this is the first time there had been a youth and children's pavilion, and it was an incredibly energetic space, lots of action, enormous amount of participation, lots of press attention, lots of cheering. However, on several occasions, I wondered the extent to which their youth voice was at times being used as a proxy for discussions of education. So I think that's one of, there's a lot of youth presence. There was not as huge an education presence, I think, as I might have expected. Also, concerns have been expressed that this raising youth voice also then silences or quietens concerns for children. So children sometimes just get subsumed into youth, but actually they have different concerns. And then in discussions with some members from the youth organisations, they've expressed frustration over power and how some youth activists are getting a lot of attention and they are sought after, whereas there's a whole lot of youth out there who are not getting the press attention and are not sought after, but are also working really hard. So there's some, there's some, some undercurrents there related to youth voice. And there was also some other conversations with delegates who had been members of the youth organisations, who are now starting to realise the different ways that you can influence. And so that turning up with demands to policymakers isn't necessarily the most effective way to actually influence helpfully at these forums. So there's some really interesting stuff going on with youth, which I'm wanting to think about further. Activism was another reflection, much lower presence of activists at this COP. This photo on the left, it's a bit cheesy, but there's an activist in the background you can see there who's about to be escorted off the away from the conference centre. So I got my colleague to take a photo of me while that was happening in the background. It's a bit cheeky. A couple of days, there were also these vegan protests, which was all very quiet and controlled. And then on the Thursday, I think it was, there was actually a march of delegates that numbered in the hundreds rather than in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands as at previous COPs. So there was some noise, was allowed to go ahead, but it was a much quieter conference. There's also the green zone. I'm not going to actually talk about that too much because I've talked too much already. Last couple of slides and then we'll move to questions. I think for me, one of the most difficult and compelling moments of my week came when I was listening to the stories from people who are sharing what's actually going on in their at home. and particularly how it's impacting students' abilities to participate in schooling. In the UK Pavilion, I listened to this Kenyan environmentalist and climate activist, Elizabeth Wafuti, who you may have heard of. She's spoken previously. And she described the devastating effect of drought on children's schooling. And these stories are really distressing to hear. And then I also heard from other panelists who followed immediately after a lack of engagement with actually what that story was. So it was a complete slip into key messages, you know, and I found that really difficult to stomach, that you could hear this and then not actually hold that in your hand and think about that with the audience. So these were some of the hardest moments for me, but they were also the most motivating moments for me, because it just really makes me realize how important our roles are as researchers who can access policymakers to help them understand or recognise that climate change education is more than science education, that climate change education involves helping young people to, well, helping everyone to have empathy for others and about thinking through problem solving and how complex the situation is. So it gave me whilst it was pretty upsetting at the time, it also gave me a bit of a kick along to see if we can do more. And then finally, it's just to go, it's just to think, was about, before I went, I was thinking about Together for Implementation. That was the hashtag this year. And you know, again, it's easy to get cynical about a hashtag, and does it mean more than branding? And some of the sustainability features were pretty easy to judge. This row of bikes turned up, I think, on day 3, and unused. And you know, if you read a newspaper, you would get quite cynical. However, I actually think it is much more than a hashtag. I think Together for Implementation is actually the story of the COP for me, and the spirit of the COP that makes me believe that it's worth it. So for me, the negotiators are absolute heroes. These policymakers and work with political actors, and they just work tirelessly under very difficult circumstances to make an international agreement. So this collaboration, this working together, is the number one for me. I also think this Together for Implementation, the top picture is me with the Egyptian focal point. And she told me stories about this is a really important opportunity for her as a woman, as a mother, to be able to fulfill her role as a policymaker, because she could actually go to the COP whilst it was in Egypt. She also told me about the young people they talked to in Egypt who thought this was the only time this event had ever occurred. They didn't realize it was the 27th. So this is a really important learning, I guess, for me. The photo of the 4 of us in the bottom, they are colleagues from the MEIS project. So COP is an important opportunity to actually collaborate amongst researchers, amongst practitioners, and it brings you together to make progress. The top right is myself with my UCL colleagues. And we hadn't met before, and you realise actually what capacity and what skills and knowledge exists in your research institution related to climate change. And that's a pretty powerful tool now that we have. And then the bottom one is a bit cheesy, but we were standing in front of this COP sign taking photos, and I was trying to be a hashtag, and I thought, well, that's silly. And so I said to my colleagues, can you take another one? I want my family to be proud. And there were these 2 young guys standing next to us, near to us. And this young guy said to me, you don't need to take another one. Your family is already proud, right? And that for me is like totally the spirit of COP, that COP gives so many people a chance to go and get together and make an impact and talk about this really important issue, and it shines a light on it like nothing else. So for me, that being there together amongst this enormous festival of climate change is really worth it, and it's the togetherness of it that is the impact. So from here, I think it's about continuing to engage with policymakers and political actors. It's about continuing to influence informally through relationship building. It's about supporting our policymakers and political actors, and even thinking ourselves about how work in climate change education actually lines up with the other 6 elements of ACE. is starting to think about, well, what do we need to do to get ready for Abu Dhabi, which is going to have a focus. That's next year's COP, which will have a focus on education. And then for Australia in particular, it's thinking about, they've put in a bid for COP31. So it's starting to get the ball rolling. What do we want that COP to achieve? I mean, that's going to be the end of the action plan, the current action plan. So that COP is going to be really important for what comes next. So, yeah. And
thank you so much, Kate. Really appreciate your work and everything. And I know from my perspective, having never been to COP before, your reflections on COP and outlining what it's like to be there and the process was really beneficial and really interesting. So thank you so much. We have a chance for questions, so I'll open it up to questions from attendees.
Hi, can I start?
For Jason.
Thanks, Kate. That was very, very interesting, having that inside kind of look at something that looks so far away when you look at it in the media. And I came in 2 or 3 minutes late, so maybe you said something about this, but I think you didn't. What is your, having been there and somebody that comes from the perspective of education for climate change, how much relevance or importance in general within the whole COP meeting do you think they give to education as a strategy to address the challenge of climate change? I know it's just your perspective, there's not much measuring, but
yeah. Look, to be honest, it has a relatively low profile, right? I think my perspective, my impression, a relatively low profile amongst those involved in ACE, and there are a lot. It has a high profile, but there are 40,000 delegates, and there's an enormous industry presence, and there's an enormous focus on mitigation and adaptation. So relatively low, but there's probably a lot of other aspects of the negotiations or the conference that feel similarly sidelined or quietened, it doesn't seem to matter really who you talk to, apart from some of the industry bods that I spoke to. So I would say it has quite a relatively low, and one of the things there that I'm sort of grappling with then is what is then the impact of the high profile of youth engagement on then the profile of education, and really fulsome discussions of what education is, because youth are participating, right across the conference, not just in discussions about education. So, yeah. But we were at an event when unofficially it was announced, and someone probably put it straight on Twitter, that education was going to be a real focus in Abu Dhabi. So we'll see.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, Kate. Can I ask a question? My name is Miso. I'm course coordinator of Master of Environment and Sustainability at Monash. I was a PhD student of Ireland a few years ago, finished PhD 2019. I have a question about engage with the policymaker, not during the COP 27 or 28 or 26, but other 50 weeks we have around the year. Do you have any perspective of how can we engage better with the policymaker, not during the COP, but other days? And also, how can we build relationship better in everyday life in our practice as educator or researcher?
Yeah, I think so. My previous research has sort of talked to policy influencers and policymakers here in the UK, and they've all spoken about various techniques that they use to influence policy, and many of them are really about a variety of techniques, actually lining up a variety of techniques. So it can be more depending on what sort of gravitas you have. So Monash would have quite a bit of gravitas to bring to the table, and so it's hosting seminars, but places where these policymakers can feel comfortable to discuss and ask questions, rather than it necessarily being putting a policymaker on a stage with a bunch of people who are impassioned, where they know they're going to have to be defensive. You know, I also think once you've found a connection, sometimes it can be hard to find those connections. It's about finding ways to have more, you know, casual conversations as well. So it's coffees and it's those sort of more under the radar. So, and building a trusting, you know, rapport with them about your expertise. Having worked in the civil service myself, I sort of understand that these, you know, you really are in tension in those jobs because you're really trying to negotiate with a whole lot of interests, and researchers have a really valuable contribution you can make that doesn't have to have the same sort of, you don't have to put them under the same pressure, I guess, to defend their position or that sort of thing. So yeah, I think the role of informal influence is really valuable, and then working out at which level to engage with whom. So, you know, you don't get, you really think about when to engage with the high level person and what sort of information to provide. And generally speaking, less is best. You know, in talking with these people, some of these people at COP, they said they're all very positive about the engagement. There's no criticism of it, but that when they get hit with barrage of text and demands in their inbox, like it's just not helpful at that point of the process. So, yeah.
So if that's our common day practice, what would be the unique difference between COP27, this big event, to our everyday practice to engage with the policymaker?
So I think at COP27, at the COPs, it's about making sure you've got your story straight on what you are advocating for. It's knowing that your interactions will last for 5 minutes, and then you can send them a few sentences in their inbox or to their WhatsApp. Like, they're really short interactions. And so you've got to really make the most of what you have to offer in those interactions is probably really key in that forum. Yeah, is the pace of them and the brevity of them. So it's being really clear about it. I think also one of the reflections was that sometimes they get provided with sort of some general thoughts or principles or something, and actually in that environment that's not very helpful. You know, again, in that environment they want specificity. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hi Kate, thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot because, as Jason said, I think that I saw that, or I knew about COP here in Australia. I come from Colombia, and I was having a look to the newspaper in Colombia, and they haven't posted anything about COP.
Wow.
So I think that it's quite interesting, because I think that we don't know about COP, and we don't see the influence in Colombia of COP. We see that too far away from us. But I was going to ask you, like, your perspective or your thoughts about the influence of all these discussions and policy documents, like in practice. Do you see, or I don't know if you have in mind, like, focus your research on this, on the real implementation or the real evidence, or of how these discussions are affecting the practice in schools, in higher education? Like, I don't know what's the gap between these discussions, like the policy itself, with the implementation, you know, the practice.
Yeah. And Ellen, you've sort of disappeared at the moment, but please feel free to chip in on this as well. I think so a couple of reflections there is that the impact and the prominence of ACE, I think, really varies across countries. And so certainly in countries like the UK, ACE, from the time I've been here, ACE has quite a low profile. And it's much more, it's sort of, education has been quite isolated or siloed, you know, silos abound. And even we've now, since the COP had COP's still going, since we were at COP, and we engaged quite a lot with our Department for Education there, they are now interested in talking about education as part of ACE, right? And so now coming up with an ACE action plan in the UK. And in talking with the focal point there, they were really quite desperate for the action plan to be agreed, because that then gives them the tool with which they can use to make the case to do a national action plan. So, and they've held, the argument was they held off on doing that here because they knew the action plan was coming. And so if they went out and engaged with stakeholders, their stakeholders this year, and then and came up with something, and then the ACE action plan comes out and they don't match, well, then they've got to re-engage with those stakeholders, and then they burn a lot of bridges in that way. And so, but I think for other countries who might be more reliant upon funding that's tied to some of these international agreements, ACE may have a bigger profile for them and drive more action, and particularly related to public participation and public awareness and some of these things. So really variable, but certainly I can see in the UK under some of the current people that we've connected with there that I think it could be a really valuable tool for pushing things a bit further. So that's a reflection for me. But Alan, do you want to add anything there from your experience in it? Or not?
I think he's struggling with connection.
Having some connection.
Yeah, connection issues.
Yeah.
Sorry, Kate, I was wondering just quickly, because you spoke about the silos and you've spoken about ACE. So that made me think, how do the different, like ACE and the other aspects, how do they communicate? Was it in one of those consultation spaces that you spoke about in your presentation, or is it too siloed? Does it?
So a couple of ways they connect. So ACE is part of a meeting, a group called the Subsidiary Body for Implementation. And in this particular body, I think there were like, I don't know, maybe 25 agenda items, and ACE was one of those agenda items. And there's also capacity building as an agenda item. That's a different aspect of the negotiations, and adaptation and so on and so forth. So at the agenda for the meetings sets out all of these. Now, a number of the focal points, the people or the negotiators, they will negotiate ACE and they'll negotiate gender, and they'll negotiate capacity building and adaptation. They're often sort of connected. And so those people will actually be drawing connections between them, you know, during the week and ongoing in their work. So that's the second way. A third way is that countries will go in with sort of a position, and that position will look across a number of those elements and see, you know, what do we want to include in ACE, but what actually are we putting in capacity building, for instance. So there'll be some country level sort of analysis there and some sort of plan that goes on there. And then fourth, the action plan for ACE includes policy. One of the actions is policy coherence. So that is a commitment by parties to undertake activities that that will mean that ACE lines up with other UN programs, work programs, and other aspects of so it's lining up policies. That's part of the job of this ACE action plan, to say, well, where does ACE actually line up with human rights, and where does it line up with children's rights strategies, and, you know, gender strategies, and so on and so forth. So there's a it's not this is how it happens, but it happens in a number of different ways, and thus completely imperfectly, but pretty good because it's enormous. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. We probably have time for one more question or reflection.
Who'd like to go to Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Who's got a plan for a side event at Abu Dhabi? Hey?
Well, I think if there's no other questions or reflections, I just want to say again, thank you so much, Kate, for your time. And I've definitely found it incredibly interesting, as other people have mentioned, and your thoughts about youth and engaging youth and across all aspects, not just putting them in the education bucket. I thought that was really interesting, how the systems work, and engaging with policymakers as well. It sounds incredibly hard, that work, and maintaining confidentiality, but at the same time, making sure you're accurately reflecting, the sorts of information you're receiving as well, and the time limited nature of that sort of work as well. I can see lots of people in the chat are putting their thanks as well for you, Kate, if you want to have a look. But otherwise, as I said, thank you so much, Kate. Thank you everyone for coming along. Alan, hopefully you're still with us to a certain extent. Yeah. Yeah. All right, great. Thanks everyone. Nice to see you all, and thanks again, Kate.
You're welcome.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Kate. Thank you.
Bye bye.